Mass Effect Andromeda was a game carrying a lot of baggage when it arrived in our galaxy 1 year ago. It had to satisfy its legendary developers' increasingly divided fanbase and continue a franchise that delighted as many people as it ultimately divided with possibly the most infamous ending in video game history.
I need to stop the Reapers. Do you know how I can do that?
The Reapers are mine. I control them. They are my solution.
Solution? To what?
Chaos.
You fucking what, mate?
Mass Effect Andromeda was the promise of a new start for the series. A new setting, a new cast, taken far, far away from the tangled mess that the Star Child, Retake, Mass Effect and Marauder Shield had left the Milky Way in. Unfortunately, it was not to be. Despite an enticing reveal promising a return to the exploration focus of Mass Effect 1 that many players had missed in the games that followed, a seemingly endless chain of delay slowly eroded this initial enthusiasm before we finally got a good look at the game and saw...
Focus defences here and here. The Ket have been quiet for too long. See? No reason we can't be civilized.
Yeah. Suffice to say, those skeptical of the game suddenly found themselves with ample confirmation of their skepticism. And I was in that boat. Mass Effect as a story sort of lost me the moment it decided to conclude its 100+ hour saga with a JPEG begging us to buy DLC. I don't know what changed my mind. Maybe, in a moment of weakness, I decided I needed the comfort of the Bioware game format, a design philosophy that had brought me no end of joy in the past. And so, one evening in spring, in the middle of nowhere, a young man with questionable tastes and a tiny wallet bought Mass Effect Andromeda in the dead of night, shame crawling down his spine. And, against all odds, he liked it. Where the internet seemed only to see busted facial animations and a generic plot, I saw the most fun game in the entire series, charming characters that got their hooks deep into me, and a story that offered me a lot of thematic meat to chew on. I've watched with growing sadness as the collective cultural consensus surrounding Mass Effect Andromeda wrote it off as little more than an embarrassment on the resumes of everyone who worked on it. I think this game has a lot more to offer than that, and I hope this video is able to show why I think Mass Effect Andromeda is secretly good. But before we get into the big ideas and heady themes this game most assuredly does have to offer, let's address perhaps the most important question for, a video game. How does Mass Effect Andromeda actually play? Begin with an effective evolution of the series' core design philosophy as that developed by Mass Effect 3. Mix in a healthy portion of Mass Effect 1 and top it off by sprinkling in a not insignificant dash of Dragon Age Inquisition. Voila! A new Mass Effect sequel, guaranteed to electrify a whole new generation of players. Just make sure you don't undercook those facial animations. That would be a disaster. The first major change that stuck out to me was that the series' iconic Paragon/Renegade conversation system is completely gone, replaced with a system where each response is based on tone. Now, instead of being nice, a dick, or boring, you can choose to be flippant, passionate, thoughtful, or boring. Choice. Despite Paragon or Renegade being pretty synonymous with Mass Effect as a brand, this is actually a welcome change for me, as I've never really been a lover of the conversation system used in the original trilogy. It's inevitably led to situations where you would just decide at the start of your playthrough whether you're going for a Paragon or Renegade run, and then pick every single conversation option that corresponded to that initial choice, maybe changing when you feel you become a robot picking the same options over and over. It also tended to be overly ambiguous, with the very small amount of information you're presented with often leading to misunderstandings.
But he decided to keep the data for himself. Maybe to sell it. I don't know.
I should kill both of you idiots.
Redefining the conversation system to be based on tone rather than morality is a great change. It makes your character feel like they have a bit more of a personality and gives you more nuance in how you want to respond to each situation. You're still likely to have a preferred approach, but, cleverly, the game doesn't give you every option every time, forcing you to make more pluralistic decisions that lead to a less one-note player character. It's still got some issues. Why the hell do we still have a boring bastard option? But it's a positive step towards improving Mass Effect's role-playing component. So, we've covered the talky side of things, so how about we get stuck into the shooty bang bang slice of the Andromeda pie? No, that's not... you know what I mean.
Except I'm gonna fuck your shit up. How's that for Quaid?
The series has always struggled to unify the role-playing and shooter aspects of its design philosophy. Mass Effect 1 placed the emphasis slightly towards RPG, with an exhaustive list of side quests, large array of planets to land on that looked like they were made with a stock Unreal Engine terrain in it in about 5 minutes, shooting that was slow and stodgy, and absolutely interminable inventory management. Mass Effect 2 improved the shooting to the dizzying heights of being basically alright, but in the process jettisoned practically the entirety of the game's RPG elements. Mass Effect 3 attempted to redress the balance somewhat, improving the shooting further to the point where it was actually a pretty excellent cover shooter, being fast and fluid for its subgenre, and even managed more in-depth skill trees, and a weight system that forced the player to consider more carefully what weapons they took into battle. Andromeda continues this development, and adds another layer to it with the introduction of the series' first fully fleshed out open world design. No, Mass Effect 1's auto-generated terrain planets don't count. The combat is about as fast as 3 in terms of movement, but cover is really de-emphasised this time, with much more emphasis on using your ample movement abilities to deal with enemies quickly and then dodge out of their attacks. While you can play by sitting behind cover and occasionally firing at exposed limbs, I find it much more engaging to spec for close quarters combat. Equip the absolutely essential charge ability and use it and your dodges to bob and weave in and out of combat like some kind of mad shotgun-toting space ninja. Your ludicrously high jump also adds another layer of verticality to combat. No longer is the ideal strategy to wait for enemies to poke out from behind chest-high walls. Not when you can leap over said wall and headshot them while hovering in mid-air. Powers have also been rebalanced to further emphasise their use. Abilities now combine together much more elegantly than before, with combinations like grabbing hold of an enemy with pull, and then using push to throw them away, and detonating stunned enemies with certain abilities for massively increased damage. Abilities in Andromeda therefore harmonise much more naturally than in Mass Effect 2 and 3, which determine whether or not an ability would affect an enemy by whether it had shields, armour, or just health. It's a more free-flowing system, which synchronises well with the game's more open design. So the combat is more organic and free-flowing. But what about the leveling? Classes have been removed entirely from Mass Effect Andromeda. You can build Ryder in however manner you want from the 3 archetypes, tech, combat and biotic, choosing to specialise or diversify as much as you want. Well, maybe it's not right to say that classes have been completely removed. Once the tutorial's finished and you've officially become the Pathfinder, you can switch between various profiles in the menu whenever you want. Each one of these profiles offers specific buffs to certain playstyles. Equipping the Soldier profile, for example, orients your stats to be far better suited to getting the most out of your direct weaponry, buffing your weapon damage significantly, among other things. But guns are for the weak, right? You want to just throw down like Nif 2 Cal and become a true blue biotic god? Then Adept is the profile for you, my friend. There's a profile for each of the original 6 classes of the series, and each one gives you buffs for that playstyle without depriving you of any abilities from any others. You can choose to be an engineer and still throw out biotics if that's what you want. Each profile can be unlocked with a low investment of skill points into each tree, providing a low enough barrier to entry that you're encouraged to mix and match freely. However, the profiles can be upgraded by spending points in skill trees, increasing the buffs each profile offers. This is actually a pretty ingenious system that rewards players that want to specialise and players who want to change their playstyle every 5 minutes. I hope that, if Mass Effect ever does return, it doesn't forget this great system. In terms of world design, Mass Effect Andromeda brings a lot of classic Mass Effect ideas into a more Dragon Age Inquisition style framework. Like that game, Andromeda presents you with a collection of large levels, each with a list of tasks and activities, and, usually, a quest hub. Rarely will you be able to see everything a world has to offer on your first visit. The game encourages you to regularly leave the planet you're questing on, and do other things, then revisiting once new content is opened up. This neatly sidesteps that completionist urge that led many players, myself included, to stay in Inquisition's hinterlands longer than is healthy for the human mind. The system also gives the game a strong sense of forward momentum that the more aimless metagame of Inquisition often lacked. Each planet has specific quest-related progression, each questline affecting the world in ways that make sense, unlike Inquisition. Oh, would you look at that? Rescuing that lost sheep finally gave me the power and influence I need to challenge the might of nations and shake the heavens themselves. Neat. While the questing is improved over Dragon Age Inquisition, with more quests that have actual story content and decisions, Andromeda still falls into that modern open world game trap of too much of the side content of the game being repetitive tasks that amount to little more than busy work. I guess I should be grateful I'm not climbing towers. Instead I'm doing Sudoku. The fun never stops in Mass Effect Andromeda. The game's compelling combat does prevent things from becoming too repetitive, but it is still worth mentioning. My least favourite aspect of the gameplay design is the scanning mechanic, used to gather research points. I suspect this was added after The Witcher 3 somehow managed to convince everyone that holding a button down and following a trail was amazing quest design, and it's about as engaging here as it was there. It's not as irritating as it could be, as you can only scan each thing once, and the game generally does a good job of indicating what is and isn't scannable. But aside from adding a tiny bit of flavour to the proceedings, it doesn't do much more than just slow down the exploration. The points you get from scanning are fed back into your research system, where you spend points for your Milky Way, Helios, or Remnant research pools to gain new weapons, mods, or armour pieces, which you can then develop with resources found through various means. The whole thing feels very anemic and tacked on, as with so many upgrade systems in modern games these days. But the research component does at least make you feel like you're learning more and more about Andromeda and adapting to survive there, though Lord knows why you have to research all the Milky Way tech as well. Overall though, this open-ended and player-driven approach design makes Andromeda, to me at least, the best playing game in the entire Mass Effect series. While Mass Effect 3's strong linear mission design often feels lost in the open world, the moment-to-moment gameplay of Andromeda surpasses every other game in the series for me, and while the crafting systems and world design leave something to be desired, I have no doubt that the next Mass Effect game will improve on this formula and... oh, right. Let's change tacks to another area where Mass Effect Andromeda doesn't get the appreciation it deserves. Its story. Something I was pretty cynical about before launch. Despite some well-produced trailers, I didn't know too much about the story, and what I had seen seemed to suffer from save-the-world-itis. This debilitating disease infects many games, and can be defined as when a story introduces an interesting, unique, and grounded plotline, only for it to eventually devolve into a story about the hero saving the world from a bad man. Terminal sufferers of this disease include Dragon Age Inquisition, Final Fantasy Tactics, and I assume that Andromeda would fall into this camp as well. Colonizing another galaxy and dealing with the natives seemed like a perfectly interesting story in and of itself, without the need for these weird space orc guys to generic the place up. Although this is still basically the case in the final product, Andromeda's story is still a lot stronger than I gave it credit for, and it managed to win me over pretty early on with a metatextual element to the narrative that demonstrates the care and attention this mostly new cast of creators had for the Mass Effect franchise. This element can be found in the personal dimension of Andromeda's story, the story of the Ryders. The idea of the player having a family is something Bioware has flirted with from time to time. Imoen, being the Baldur's Gate PC's childhood friend, and later half-sister, encourage you to keep her around despite her somewhat limited effectiveness in combat. Dragon Age Origins gave the player some degree of family with whom they could interact with both before and after you began your journey. Dragon Age 2 lent into family quite a bit, giving the player a brother and a sister, one of whom, depending on your class, would die, a mother whose well-being you'll be in charge of for much of the game, a verbally abusive uncle whom you'd be indebted to, and, potentially, a romantic interest who would move in with you and engage in a more domestic depiction of romance that had ever really been seen in a Bioware game. When I first played Dragon Age 2, I found this use of family really interesting, in a genre that so often relies on the trope of the orphaned hero without a home, and Mass Effect Andromeda revisits it in an effective way. In the original Mass Effect games, while you could choose backgrounds for Shepard that would change how he got to where he was today, there wasn't a single one that actually had any real influence over his story or character. A couple of side quests aside, Shepard was effectively a blank slate, free for you to shape as you willed. Ryder, the player character of Mass Effect Andromeda, by contrast has a much more defined relationship with her family. She'll always have a great affection for her dead mother, a somewhat strained relationship with her father, and will be very close to her brother. The details can be affected by your own decisions, but the broad strokes remain the same. While this does reduce the scope of roleplay within Ryder's character somewhat, this slight reduction does buy the game the ability to intertwine its personal family plot with a healthy dose of metatext that deals with Mass Effect Andromeda's complicated relationship with the original trilogy. Alec Ryder, the player character's father, is an N7, just like Commander Shepard. Also like Shepard, he's a visionary leader, looked up to as a paragon by those under his command. And, just like Shepard, he's been ostracized from certain elements of government due to radical notions they are unwilling or unable to accept. It's clear then that Alec is representative of Shepard, and thus the original Mass Effect trilogy, while you, the player Ryder, is a younger, more inexperienced soldier, struggling to live up to the weight of the legacy and responsibility that has been suddenly thrust upon you. When we understand that the relationship between Ryder and her father is symbolic of the relationship between Mass Effect Andromeda and the original trilogy, it becomes clear that Andromeda is placing the first 3 games on a pedestal that it, consciously, does not feel capable of living up to. This dichotomy is best demonstrated in this memorable early scene where the Riders fight alongside each other for the last time. Unless you're a Vanguard who liberally uses the charge ability, you're not even going to remotely keep up with your father, who will effortlessly blow through the opposition with alarming speed and efficiency. Considering the AI in the rest of the game is somewhat clunky to say the least, I think it's apparent that a lot of effort went into giving Alec this appearance, and it works really well. It's also made clear that Alec is making use of profiles in this section, a mechanic Shepard did not have, but one that pointedly the player as Ryder will have. This subtly indicates that the journey the player will be undertaking as Ryder will not just be about them getting stronger and leveling up in the traditional RPG manner, but will be about Andromeda slowly being able to metaphorically live up to the standards set by the original Mass Effect trilogy. Now that's good stuff. At the end of the sequence, the Riders come across a bizarre alien device, and the discovery is really sold by the direction, soundtrack and dialogue to be something truly majestic. Something Ryder specifically says is,
"These are the moments that make it all worthwhile."
This is actually somewhat at odds with his role as a Shepard parallel if you look at the original trilogy as a whole. Shepard's role there could far more often be likened to that of a soldier diplomat rather than an explorer, with one exception. The one game in the series that truly prioritised that aspect of its design, and the game that Andromeda continually looks to as its foundation, the original. Alec Ryder is a Shepard parallel, yes, but I think, specifically, he's more than that. He's the living avatar of Mass Effect 1, that flawed game that started it all. At the end of the scene, the machine backfires in some way, which could be representative of the ultimate failure of Mass Effect 1's exploration elements, but even I think I'm reaching a little with that one, and both Riders find themselves flung out into the wilderness of this alien world. We live in the age of the soft reboot. Old franchises are being resurrected left and right, given a new coat of paint, being rejigged and retold for a newer, younger audience, whilst attempting to not alienate the old fans by tossing out all the old continuity and stories they grew attached to. The spirit of these franchises has proven elusive, however. Star Wars The Force Awakens had the tone spot on, but the hollow repeat of past events made it all feel a bit token, despite there being some wonderful characters and great ideas underneath the plot point recycling, while The Last Jedi went in the complete opposite direction, aggressively dismantling the Star Wars mythos in a manner that seemed to alienate as many people as it enthralled. The J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies are something of a halfway house between the traditional reboot and this new kind, with a new continuity and a new universe with younger versions of the original cast, but they still had old Spock around playing a fairly key role in the plot and character arcs. Their merits as stories aside, both of these represent somewhat clumsy attempts to have their continuity cake and eat it too, so it comes as some surprise that Mass Effect Andromeda, in a medium often looked down upon for its storytelling chops compared to film, manages a more elegant and thoughtful soft reboot than either of these two franchise juggernauts combined. When Alec Ryder passes the mantle of Pathfinder on to his child, it's more than just giving the player the title they'll use for the rest of the game. Alec Ryder, as Mass Effect 1, is symbolically passing on the torch of the series in a more subtle way than anyone could have expected. See, Pathfinder isn't just a title. What makes you special is that you and your AI buddy, Sam, are symbiotically linked in a way that mirrors the relationship between the player and the game designer. While you make all the complex decisions and emotional judgments that an AI like Sam just isn't equipped for yet, Sam grants you the mechanics you need to defeat your enemies, explore the world, and generally survive and thrive within the Helios cluster. I'd argue that the fact that Sam was originally bonded with Alec, aka Mass Effect 1, means that he represents the design philosophy of that game, and that you, as the player writer, are carrying those ideas into this new frontier. And this is all just in the first mission. So that's all well and good, but what you want to know is how the space orcs fit into this, right? Surely there's nothing more to them than the generic bad guys they initially appear to be at first glance. I mean, just look at this guy. He even looks like Corypheus. I bet no one can tell them apart at the annual Bioware villain conventions, not least because they both have a void where their personality should be. When we discuss the Ket Empire, it's important to distinguish them from this guy, their leader in the Helios cluster, the Archon. The Archon serves as the game's antagonist in a more traditional sense, and he sucks. He's a completely generic, paint-by-numbers villain who has barely any personality beyond being a dick. The only good thing about him is how he feeds into the larger metaphor of the Ket. He's a complete nothing, and from a series that gave us memorable antagonists like Saren, Casey Hudson, and the Elusive Man, he sticks out like a sore thumb. Thankfully, the Ket themselves are a hell of a lot more interesting. Now, while I've tried to avoid specific spoilers where I can up to this point, it's pretty much impossible to really talk about the Ket without giving away some of the game's biggest surprises. If you haven't played the game yet and want to have a fresh experience, skip to this timecode so you don't get completely spoiled. When the Andromeda Initiative first arrives in Helios, their first contact is not against the Remnant, the robotic leftovers of an ancient civilization known as the Jordan, or even their children, the Angara. Rather, they first encountered these ugly space goblins, and pretty soon after encountered the business end of their guns. This scene, in which you must use shotgun diplomacy on the first aliens you encounter in this new galaxy, is one of the most criticised aspects of the game. From the more technical plot questions like why wasn't the Initiative prepared for an alien species that wouldn't be able to understand them, to the rather ugly gun-toting picture it paints of the new arrivals in Andromeda. The scene has been used to paint Mass Effect Andromeda as a game that tacitly supports colonialism, and taking this scene out of context with the rest of the game and giving everything else it has to offer a completely surface level examination could return that reading. But I think that if you dig a little beneath the surface, you'll find a game that does have thoughtful things to say about colonialism, and those things aren't particularly kind. Now, colonialism is a pretty loaded word, and there's going to be a lot of definitions out there that conflict and contradict one another. For the purposes of this argument, and for the sake of brevity, I'm going to define colonialism as material/cultural control and exploitation of a country or people. Despite the initial assumptions of the Initiative, the Ket aren't actually natives of the Helios cluster. They're from outside, just like you. The Archon isn't even the supreme leader of the Ket. As his name would imply, he's closer to the captain of the Ket expeditionary force into the Helios cluster, given very colonial orders by the true leader of the Empire. Bring everything and everyone in the Helios cluster under the control of the Ket, for the glory of the Emperor. They're basically a traditional European imperial force, except more green and rocky and, well, actually about the same amount of evil. Furthering this comparison, as you progress through the main quest, the game reveals schism within the Ket's ranks, as the Archon begins to cut off ties with the mainland empire and hoard the Remnant's tech for himself and his own. Notably, the Archon's obsession with the Remnant is considered downright perverse by other Ket, demonstrating the depths of their xenophobia. Later on, you're even approached by one of the Ket loyal to the Empire, who proposes a temporary alliance to deal with the Archon, one of the game's more interesting choices that probably could have led to some really interesting consequences in future Andromeda games. Shame we'll never see those consequences actually play out, huh? So, the Ket are an allegory for a colonial empire. But in my absolute favourite of Mass Effect Andromeda's sci-fi ideas, the colonial coding of the Ket goes far deeper than just making them the standard imperial dickbag culture that's pretty common for sci-fi baddies. The full picture of the Ket doesn't come into focus until the player reaches Vogue and discovers the Ket temple there. Here, we learn the true depths of the Ket's colonialism. Long ago, the Ket gave up the icky, sticky business of traditional propagation and began furthering their species through a kind of technological ritual known as exaltation. In temples like this one, native populations are brainwashed through insidious and thoroughly creepy cultural indoctrination until they become completely subservient to the Ket. Then, in a ritual that is drenched in as much religious and cultural symbolism as it is with nanomachine bullshit. The genetic structure of the unfortunate victim is rewritten until they become Ket. The vast majority of Ket you face in the game are, in fact, exalted Helios natives, Angarans and Milky Way denizens alike. You only encounter 1 or 2 pureblood Ket in the entire game, and even then, it's not explicitly stated that these are pureblood Ket, and may in fact be an exalted species from somewhere else in the galaxy. Each species rewritten by the Ket will turn out slightly differently, but the Ket genetics always completely overpower the original forms, to the point where they're practically unrecognisable. Exaltation also seems to turn its victims into stereotypes the Ket have for the race in question. Late in the game you discover Krogans being exalted, and while Krogans can indeed be violent brutes, they're still a far cry from the hulking, mindless monstrosities the Ket make them into. The Ket Empire is not just a colonial force. They are a culture so inherently colonial that colonialism has been written into their very genes. But what about the Initiative? After all, it hardly makes the game less colonial if it's simply about the nice colonists versus the evil colonists. Initially, a lot of the imagery, language and actions of the Andromeda Initiative does portray them to be a colonial force. They are, on a surface level, colonists by definition, settling on uncharted land far, far away from home with the intention of creating an extension of their existing society back in the Milky Way. They do not come with the intention of subsuming into Andromeda's cultural norms or submitting to any existing power structure of the galaxy. They bring with them their biases and beliefs, their cultures, and an expectation of independence. For example, one of the first things we hear about happening was the Nexus Uprising, an event elaborated upon in a book I haven't read, wherein a civil war aboard the Nexus ultimately leads to a contingent of the population being exiled and the Krogans abandoning the Initiative. Even before the players arrived in Andromeda, the Initiative's foreign culture is etched upon the Helios cluster, in a manner that certainly does seem colonial. Moreover, the game directly draws comparisons between the remnant, robotic leftovers of the true natives of the Helios cluster, and the many exotic ancient civilizations that have been plundered by European colonists in the past. The triangular design much of the remnant architecture uses suggests societies such as ancient Egypt and Mesoamerican cultures like the Maya and the Aztec. And then, of course, we have the Angara, who are presented throughout the entire experience to be the natives of the Helios cluster, and much of their makeup deliberately calls to mind native archetypes we're all intimately familiar with. Except, things aren't quite that simple. The truth of what the Initiative really is might be picked up on by fans of the original trilogy early on, but it doesn't come into full focus unless you follow a couple of relatively obscure side quest chains that I don't necessarily blame people for missing out on. Collecting Alec Ryder's memory triggers throughout the Helios cluster unlocks flashbacks that reveal a number of secrets about the Initiative and Alec Ryder's role within it. You learn that while eccentric billionaire Gian Garson was the public face of the Initiative, the real power behind it was a mysterious benefactor. Ooh. We never find out who this person actually was, and never will, etc, etc. But we do know why they funded the Initiative. The Reapers! Yep, it's everyone's favourite unknowable mechanical monstrosities. Those lovable rascals who made a habit of turning all intelligent life in the Milky Way into nutritious goop every 50 millennia that were actually created by giant squids and controlled by a really stupid AI, but let's just forget about that. The Initiative's benefactor knew Shepard was right when he was banging on about those copper cuttlefish like a crazy person, and funded the Initiative not as a colonial ship sent to control and secure a new living space for the Citadel species, but as a lifeboat sent into the unknown to ensure the survival of life in the Milky Way against an enemy the benefactor assumed to be unstoppable. The Initiative aren't colonists. They never were colonists. They're refugees. Understanding this fundamentally changes the relationship dynamics between the Initiative and every other species within the Helios cluster. The Angara are no longer naive natives welcoming their oppressors with open arms. They're accepting refugees in need. The Rokar, the anti-alien contingent of the Angara, are not resisting the clawing hand of colonialism, but are a racist, anti-immigrant faction, far more analogous to modern-day white supremacist organisations than any historical freedom fighter group. While the Angara are the closest thing the Helios cluster has to a native population, when it comes to the Initiative, they are actually coded far closer to a traditional European power, reacting in multifaceted ways to a sudden influx of refugees. The unification of all three of these groups, the Angara, the Rokar, the Initiative, and their fight against the Ket, makes Andromeda not a story of white makes right colonial handwashing, but of multiple cultures learning to work and thrive together against an imperialistic enemy. Not bad for a game I thought would be an awkward exercise in colonial hand washing. When Andromeda first came out to fairly tepid reviews and, let's call it, an unenthusiastic fan reaction, I was somewhat disappointed, but I did take it in stride to a certain extent. I'm kinda used to finding myself outside the internet's consensus for this kind of thing, and the only feelings I really held towards the discussion were, gosh, people are very upset about these animations, aren't they? Even after EA announced that they were putting the franchise on ice despite what seemed to everyone to be strong sales, I can't say I put too much thought into it once my first playthrough was finished. Eventually, other games and other concerns came along, and any idle thoughts I had about Mass Effect Andromeda were lost. But then, one day, when I was idly browsing through this vile hellscape we call the internet, I saw an accusation levelled against the game whenever it seemed to come up, one that I found rather head-tilting. According to these commenters, Mass Effect Andromeda was bad sci-fi. The accusation struck a chord with me. I immediately disagreed with it, but then I had to ask a number of questions that led me down a path towards this very video. If Andromeda was bad sci-fi, then what was good sci-fi? What were the criteria of sci-fi that Andromeda failed to reach? Now, we're all going to have different stipulations and rules as to what constitutes a genre and what doesn't, but we're going to have to make a foundation if we're going to get anywhere. So, sci-fi. To me, science fiction is simply the other side of the coin to fantasy. Both genres are about the concerns, ideas and themes of the time, place and mind in which they are created, and presented with a fresh perspective in a fantastical setting. Star Trek may have been set in the 23rd century, but its vision of a utopian future, a united humanity free of conflict, venturing eternally into an infinite horizon, all races, genders, creeds, hand in hand, was undoubtedly shaped by the times in which it was born, in the heat of the Cold War, before even the Civil Rights Act. Even Star Wars, with its incredibly fluffy science fantasy setting, was born out of war and adventure serials that its creators grew up watching. Sci-fi is never born in a vacuum. There's something of every artist in their work, and there's always something of the world in which they live in every artist. Therefore, every sci-fi world is always a reflection of our world, in some way, shape or form, and that essential feature is what defines the genre for me. Mass Effect has always shared DNA with Star Trek, being as it is a future wherein various species and perspectives must work together to solve impossible problems, but Andromeda is closer to this ideological core than the original trilogy ever managed. As it went on, the Mass Effect trilogy invited more and more sharp cynicism into its fundamentally optimistic premise, culminating in an ending that essentially claimed that people with differences cannot possibly live together in harmony. Andromeda reverses this trend, and, like so many other aspects of its story and design, returns to its roots of Mass Effect 1, telling a story that is, at its core, about how in an increasingly diverse, pluralistic and borderless world, we need to learn to work together in order to fulfill our full potential. And it does it through the lens of a space millennial running over space orcs in a six-wheeler. I mean, if that isn't art, I don't know what is.